Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 20th of August. Today we're looking at some important developments beginning with the Pokrovsk front, then moving on to New York and Toretsk, and we'll finish off by looking at the Kursk offensive to the north. Let's zoom in and look at specific updates based on geolocated footage and reports from Ukrainian sources. In yellow, you can see the Russian advances over the past 24 hours. The most notable advance amounts to 9.6 square kilometers, and you can see that the Russian forces were able to clear out the remaining fields and hills located east of the Vavcha River. So I'll mark that for you guys over here, these hills. And then they also made it all the way to the riverbed itself. And in the process, were able to capture Skuchne and Mezhove, two hamlets that the Ukrainians actually abandoned earlier this week because there was no feasible way to remain in control of them from a defensive standpoint. It was just too much of a casualty yielder, you could say. And so the Russian forces have now taken it over. And in the process, they've nearly taken over all the positions east of the river. The only question mark we have is surrounding Hrodivka itself. If we zoom in, we know that the Russian forces have intermittently conducted armored assaults towards the southern portion of the hamlets, but they've never been able to keep a permanent foothold there up until recently. And since then, we haven't received any elaboration on the status of the northern portion of Hrodivka, which doesn't really have houses, but it includes this rather dense forestry area. And so the Ukrainian squads that operate near the front line, they could still be there theoretically, but we don't know for sure. And so now this Russian advance to the north will be able to close up the remaining gaps and fully take over the eastern bank of the river. And so also you have this Ukrainian position near the reservoir in the northern part of Kharlivka. And so that area also has to be cleared by the Russians. Now, the thing that's really beneficial to the Russian grouping here is that they don't have to now begin attacks towards Kharlivka from the eastern direction. Because if they were to do that without really looking anywhere else and just attacking in isolation, then it would be very risky to send in large squads and vehicles through a rather narrow pass through this crossing over here between the reservoir, or further southwards near the highway towards the village of Kharlivka itself. And that's because Kharlivka, of course, you have to pass through a body of water, you have to pass through narrow supply routes, and you're also getting overlooked by positions that are located west of Kharlivka in a really large ridge, which isn't just isolated to Kharlivka, but it's also spanning all of the region located west of the Vavcha River as it sort of ebbs and flows southwards all the way to the area just to the sort of northeast of Kurakove. And so you can see here this really large line that I'm going over in these red dots for you guys. And this is just showing you guys where the Vavcha River flows and how the Ukrainian trenches were built specifically west of this river in order to, of course, utilize the local geography, utilize the various villages there that are rather large in size, utilize the supply hubs, utilize the various sort of ridges that are all across this region that are all connected together. It's just one massive ridge running along the region west of the riverbank. And the hope was they would be able to turn it into this sort of static front line that the Russians would not be able to break by pushing directly through. But now a lot of those sort of hopes for the Ukrainians have been crushed because of the Russian exploitation of their advance further northwards through Pokrovsk and Vovche. As a result, the Russians have been able to create this really massive salient, which has now the ability to push southwards and directly flank the positions and trenches from the north, something that they really were not expecting and caught them completely off guard. And this could really change the entire Ukrainian perspective on where and when they should be defending in this particular part of Donbass. It, of course, also has implications for larger cities in the midterm, such as Saidove and Pokrovsk to the north. And also, of course, don't forget about Kurakove. That is another really important logistics hub and command center for the Ukrainians in this region. Now, if we're to zoom in for a second, we could see that the Russians have been able to advance another 700 meters southwards towards Komishivka, and so the Russians are closing in on it. You could see there's pressure from basically all directions. It is in development at this point, and we don't even know if the Ukrainians are manning these trenches located west of the Vavcha River. They may be unmanned at this point because of how close they are to the front line and how dangerous that would be. And so there is a question about how long the Ukrainians can remain in some of these frontline pockets before the Russians eventually squeeze them out. And the goal would be to eventually solidify control over all of these nearby villages such as Ptiche and Kalinove in order to finally reach the ridge that I was talking about, which really begins in full force in the Karlivka region, but the actual ridge is sort of an extension of a higher elevated region that is located just south of Zhevitne. And so now the Russians have taken over that particular village. They don't really have many obstacles in their way besides the open fields and tree lines to begin entering into this highly elevated region, which overlooks an area like Mimrik, but then on a larger scale, it overlooks the E50 highway into the West Selidove. Now, looking a bit northwards, the other major updates from this region is south of Hrodivka. So here we could see an area amounting to 6 square kilometers. It is a significant advance. The Russians were able to take over this highly elevated field south of the town. And so now the Russians are overlooking it. Not only are they pushing from the southeastern direction through this particular road that bisects Hrodivka, but they have control of these fields that are south. So that would give the Russians, of course, a vector of attack and just the perfect firing points. In addition, due to the capture of these fields, the Russians have now been able to fully capture Zhiravka. And this has been done also along this diagonal road, which is leading all the way to Krasny Yar. And at that particular point, there's a sort of T-junction, which would also connect together Krasny Yar to Hrodivka. And so by really advancing through this particular vector, the Russians have been able to degrade the Ukrainian front line connection, because the other route that is sort of nearby would be through Mykolaiivka and then advancing along this sort of rugged path all the way into Hrodivka near the ponds. And so again, you see the supply line sort of being severed and the Russians trying to gradually degrade the Ukrainian sort of temporary defense line that we're seeing being formed over here, not just based on where the villages are located, but also based on where the Ukrainians placed local trenches. And so this sort of defense line, if you could call it that, just temporary stabilization of the front line, is an area that is sort of marked in this semicircle here, sort of has a meniscus shape, and you can see the Russians are now making inroads, both elevation-wise and both into the settlements themselves. A big issue is that now the Russians are only about 5 kilometers to the southeast of Hrodivka itself. This is, or not Hrodivka, but Mironivka over here. So the situation in Mirnohrad is rather interesting because not only is it a really vertical city, you can see here that it spans like 7 kilometers, but just to the west in Pokrovsk, this area is actually located on a rather high elevation. So if we look at the sort of rail embankment that we always talk about, the Russians have been utilizing to advance deeper and deeper into the Pokrovsk front, you can see here with this diagonal rectangle formation that I'm marking, all of these regions are not only running along the rail line, but they're also on really, really high elevation. And as you go further and further to the northwest, this sort of ridge actually expands in width all the way to Pokrovsk itself, which is also located on rather high elevation. And it's also a massive rail hub, so it sort of goes hand in hand. And so in contrast to a lot of cities like Toretsk, for instance, and Donbass that are located in river valleys and low elevation, Pokrovsk is sort of the opposites. And so this is Ukraine's biggest advantage, the fact that their perimeter around here is on rather high elevation, especially the southeastern one. But this is the same region that the Russians are now slowly beginning to chip away through. And a big means by which the Russians could continue and increase in their pace would be through capturing an area like Novohrodivka, which really unlocks for you not only the E50 highway that is located even further westwards and leads directly into southern Pokrovsk, but also more generally the rail axis. That would be a really big gain for the Russians. And right now, the Russians, they are only one village away from northern Novohrodivka, Kruty Yar, which again is a really small hamlet. And they're only, for measuring it, about 1.8 kilometers away from the mine number 3, as it is referred to, the one over here, and its subsequent slag heap, which would, of course, give the Russians an amazing vantage points and firing position towards the actual town, which is largely located on lower elevation. Now, if we're looking at Hrodivka itself and zooming in, and the Russian forces are now beginning to sort of set up a solid base for future attacks deeper and deeper into the settlement. So we know they're already in control of nearby ponds and forested regions, and they've already made inroads into local residential areas and also apartment buildings. So in this video from today, the 151st Brigade, which is the main unit defending here, plus some National Guard elements, they just conducted numerous FPV strikes onto Russian forces and squads located in houses, or at least the ruins of some of them, and then also in some nearby bushes. So this is just further confirmation that the Russians are now actually operating here. Now moving on to New York, we have just a minor update from Deep State. They are claiming that the fighting does continue in the outer perimeter of New York around the town. A lot of Russian sources have already claimed the full capture of New York, but I would wait for footage because most of the footage we have from this region really is south of the main dividing line, this horizontal New Yorkska road. And those are pieces of evidence that are now from a week ago. And so we don't have a lot of changes that are particularly verified via video based on the reporting of these two massive vectors that the Russians were able to penetrate and connect into Nelipivka through. And so we have to wait and see what comes of that. But according to Deep State, the Russian forces have been able to capture an area amounting to around 0.5 square kilometers. It's a part of a combing operation of some of the Ukrainian sort of pockets where there may be some sort of holdouts. And now, in the process, the Russians have been able to clear out this really large factory, which in theory could have served as a massive sort of citadel, a massive position that could have held on for a long time. And in its isolation, definitely it could have. Assaulting it head on would have been really a nightmare. But due to the flanks being so weakened, the Ukrainians that are operating here, they really had no choice but to withdraw before their fate was fully sealed. And so whatever forces were operating here, that may be from the 53rd Brigade or from some territorial defense unit or Scala, they have been forced now to withdraw northwards to Nelipivka, where the Russian forces are continuing to solidify a foothold as they then hope to advance northwards. But at the same time, they're also involved in conducting these sort of combing operations, especially in the eastern houses that are not fully under Russian control yet. Looking a bit northwards, we have this footage which came from the Voron 100th Mechanized Brigade FPV drone group. And so they conducted various strikes onto houses and trenches in the Artemovo district, which is, I think, a part of Zalizhny, and it's sort of the northwestern portion of it, just to the west of the diagonal road. So you see the two rectangles indicating where it's located. So we know yesterday the Russians from the 1st Slavic Motor Rifle Brigade took over the slag heap here. And now we have confirmation from a video that was actually from about a week ago, the 14th, which shows that the Russian forces are also located in some of these other more rural in nature houses and then also the local cemetery. So the Russian forces are actually getting very close in this region to accessing the forested regions. And from that point, because there's still so much foliage, the front line is going to become more diluted because you're going to begin to see more of these sort of deep Russian DRG attacks. And when I say deep, I mean maybe a kilometer or two in, and it's not going to be anything solid in terms of control, but it will be a means by which the Russians exert pressure onto the southern ring of defense of Toretsk, while they also conduct really significant assaults directly into the city from the eastern highway, specifically from Pivnishnya. And so now we have evidence that the sort of infiltration into Toretsk proper has actually widened despite really only occurring along one vector, along a highway. The Ukrainians don't have the wherewithal to actually conduct a counterattack so far. And so if we're going to click on this marker here, this is from the Liut National Police Brigade. We know that most of their battalions are located here. So the Safari and Luhansk battalions, they just conducted various grenade drone drops using drones onto Russian troops here. And it's a confirmation of just a very slight advance, a couple hundred meters westwards. Then looking at Pivnishnya, now we have finally evidence that the Russians have taken over the vast majority of this district. And so let's look at the actual geolocation, because Deep State now for like a week and a half, they've been insisting that it's mainly a gray zone and that the Russians have pushed out the Ukrainians. Now we actually have the verification because of the umbrella units of the 32nd Mechanized Brigade. They also really released a lot of videos of FPVs and grenade drops onto numerous houses here in Pivnishnya. And a lot of them are in ruins. A lot of them also, they were captured specifically by Russians, and they're hiding in basements or in shacks or in the backyard. And so now we actually have the confirmation that the Russians have been able to take over an area amounting to 0.5 square kilometers. And then if we're looking at the extent of the advance, taking over the suburb, it's about 1 kilometer northwards. This means that a lot of the height on which Pivnishnya is located is now under Russian control. And this height is an extension of a really elevated area which begins north of Shumi, then extends along the highway and along the rail line into Pivnishnya itself, and then sort of fizzles out within the center of Toretsk. And so now the Ukrainians are losing a lot of some of their final remaining heights to the Russian forces. So the Russians will also begin to have a more localized elevation advantage as they begin advancing further and further westwards. And then overlooking the actual center of Toretsk, which is on low elevation, barring the nearby slag heaps. Also, it means that Druzhba now is in a precarious position because, of course, you have pressure from the east near the Bakhmutovka River, and then actually from the south where Druzhba is being attacked from these high positions. Now, a big issue mentioned by a lot of brigade level leadership that has been reported to foreign media, and this happens really on a weekly basis, these sort of reports from leadership or from more senior members in brigades to Western media, and they release, of course, reports about it. So I saw one from Financial Times today. It was from an artillery commander within one of the brigades defending in Donbass, probably either in Toretsk or in Pokrovsk, but it wasn't really specified. And what they're saying is that now, for the first time since the Americans passed the aid bill, and of course that was enacted, I believe, in September, in spring, and since then there have been higher quantities of shipments of especially 155 millimeter shells to the front line. And so, for the first time since those shipments arrived, they're now forced to begin rationing of their artillery shells and, of course, mortar shells. And this is something that, of course, we discussed a lot in the winter of 2023 and even earlier on. But for a while, for a couple of months, especially the summer, it really was alleviated, and the Ukrainians used this very brief surplus in order to expend a lot of it during their Kursk offensive. And now this leaves the Ukrainians defending in the east and Donbass in the same sort of early 2024 Hrodivka state mentality, where they really were involved in saving every single shell and being sort of very, very, very frugal in how they utilized it. And so now this is a complaint that is beginning to pop up for the first time in a while. And so it's important to mention the Ukrainian units that are complaining about this, they probably have experience in, rationing these shells, but it is, of course, an inconvenience when the Russian forces are continuing to advance. And then the one big way that you could dissolve a large squad of Russian forces besides drones would be through shelling. And that would be the most effective way to do it on a large scale, targeting sort of company level groupings or even multiple squads that are advancing through open fields or through tree lines. So in terms of prominent artillery brigades that are serving within generally the Donbass region, I don't know exactly where because it is really something that's sort of split up. The entire brigade headquarters is not together. They're not all in the same area, especially for a brigade unit. A lot of detachments are moved from one place to another. So you have the 55th, the 43rd, the 45th, and the 47th artillery brigades generally stationed around here. You have a few other ones stationed further northwards in Kursk at the moment, at least broadly having some elements there, like the 148th, and then the ones that are stationed around Pavlohrad and near Dnipro as well. They, also Poltava, you could say, they have also been moved northeastwards, you could say, or northwards to support the Ukrainian vector that is pushing into Kursk itself. And so, again, a lot of those resources have been moved away from areas where they were previously utilized in Donbass to go to here. And same thing with new shipments also moving into here as a priority. And so if we're to look at the frontline updates from Kursk itself, in this western axis, we don't have enough information about a deeper Ukrainian advance towards the rest of the Glushkovki district or in the bank south of the Seam River. But we do have information, both based on footage and satellite imagery, of the Ukrainians really striking hard near the river itself, targeting, of course, the crossings. So the Russians are in the process of evacuating, I believe, this region. That's how it looks to be, based on the fact that they are moving in a lot of engineering equipment and are setting up these pontoon bridges. You can make the argument they're trying to hold on. But again, based on the local geography, based on the pressure points that the Ukrainians have, based on the fact that basically all these villages here and all of the supply lines that could theoretically be set up by the Russians are within the range of not only artillery, but short-range artillery and FPV drones. So it makes it very hard in the long term, especially given the other areas where the Russians are moving in reinforcements to hold on to this region. And so to zoom in for you guys, really you could see here that one of those pontoon bridges, the one that is just east of Zvanoy, it's come under almost immediate attack by the Ukrainians. And so here we have the pontoon bridge itself set up around the 17th of August. And then here we have footage that is from, I believe, 19th or 20th of August, showing how the pontoon itself disappears. And you could see also that there are massive smoke plumes north of the river in this region over here. And that's due to our FPV strikes by the Ukrainians, specifically from the Requiem group. That's the name of the drone unit that did this. And they conducted like 10 FPV strikes that I could count in the video. They didn't show all of them, but they showed the smoke plumes for them towards various trucks, you could say, engineering equipment, I would believe, and maybe even the pontoon itself. Rybar denies that there was any damage done as of sort of evening of August 20th to the pontoon bridges, but they do say that the Ukrainians are striking nearby and that they may attempt to begin strikes on the pontoons themselves. But then how does that square with the fact that satellite imagery shows that the pontoon is gone as of most recently? So I don't know if the Russians just took it down themselves or if the Ukrainians actually struck it. But either way, that only leaves one pontoon left, the one that is east of Glushkovo, and maybe over the past 24 hours, the Russians have built another one that could be seen later on, maybe tomorrow, in satellite imagery. Looking at Kuranovo, over here we have another video released by the Russian side. It shows that there were 3 strikes, and it was referred to as FAB by some Russian sources, but I don't really think that it was. So I'm inclined to delete the FAB parts. But it does look there were 3 airstrikes. I think there were CAB 20s. So these are of course way smaller in their yield than even a FAB 250, for instance. And so I have these cabs, and they probably received some sort of assistance from laser guidance from like an Orlan 30. That's something that the Russians do a lot. And so I think it was from a Su-34, dropped 3 of those munitions onto what are claimed to be Ukrainian vehicles that are advancing along this particular route. It's the same road that the Ukrainians have used now since the beginning of the offensive to put pressure onto southeastern Kuranovo. And now they've been able to just completely saturate it with vehicles to the point where they're able to infiltrate into parts of the eastern town itself and reach very, very close to actually crossing over the Reka Krepna River, basically reaching the bridge over here. And that shows that there is a lack of a solid Russian line in this eastern portion. But it also confirms to us that once the Ukrainians reach the actual settled areas with houses, at that point the Russian forces are able to amass enough firepower, not from the ground maybe, but actually from the air. And it's enough for at least not to keep the Ukrainians at bay and destroy a large portion of their equipment. And so really this video to me proves that the Ukrainians don't have any sort of sizable portion of their forces in Tolpino, which basically confirms my mapping of the situation and would sort of dispute what Rybar says about clashes going on over here. It appears that the Ukrainian vectors really are centered further southwards at the approaches to Kuranovo, but so far we don't know if they've actually been able to infiltrate deeper in. There's just no proof of it. But I would say that it is very likely that Ukrainian DRG squads are now really roaming around the southern forest, either from the east or from their newly taken positions in Snagost and Vishnevka. Now looking at Olgovka again, situation here is rather ambiguous, especially based on new footage, which is actually videos that were geolocated today, but were actually recorded around 17th of August. And so we don't actually know if the situation remains the same 3 days later. So we have a video of the 225th Battalion. This is one of these Ukrainian assault units that was moved to this part of the front line, and their Pentagon drone units, their drones drop grenades, of course, into a backyard in Olgovka. This confirms that there is a certain Russian presence in the village even after the Ukrainian attacks. And then here we can see this is also, I believe, from August 17th, not from the 20th, and it's from the 225th Battalion. They recorded around 20 men, Russian soldiers from the 1st Battalion of the 810th Marine Brigade, retreating from this particular tree line. I think it was northwards and away from this particular tree line. It could actually be eastwards here, but all in all, it shows that there are a sizable portion of Russian troops that are located over here, and that they've been able to organize counterattacks that reach into the center of the village. But of course, Ukrainian drone crews are now coming in and really trying to make an effort to remain active. But again, so far, I would just refer to this area as in the gray zone. Now, we finally have confirmation that another battalion of the 810th Brigade is operating here in the Kursk area, because we know that the 382nd Battalion of that brigade is operating mainly around Suja and even further to the southeast in sort of the Borky region. And now we know that one other battalion, based on POW videos, because 2 Russian POWs from the 810th were captured within the Olgovka region, now we know that this other battalion has been integrated into the fighting is involved in, of course, conducting localized counterattacks and trying to create stability. Now, looking over here at Malaya Loknaya, there are some reports that are unverified of a Ukrainian attempt to cut off the Russian forces located nearby through this sort of western direction here. You can see the X, which is where the Ukrainians would allegedly be trying to conduct this sort of cut-off operation to try to fully squeeze out the Russians from the remaining positions within the town itself. This is not verified yet. And also, really based on the sort of stalling of the Ukrainian advance here, it really confirms that there is a strong Russian presence and a strong Russian ability to counterattack in this particular town, because the Ukrainians have been able to assault it for a while now, but never able to actually push them out in their entirety, the Russians. And so I have this video here from the 95th Air Assault Brigade, also operating around Toretsk, where they have a vehicle, I think it's a mortar, firing towards Russian positions in the village itself. I think it was actually in some rather large apartment building. And so that confirms that there are actually battles going on over there. Same thing with Ruskoy, Porechnoy. There probably are battles still ongoing here. And that's despite the fact that we have a video located northeast of the village showing a Russian airstrike into a forest that is just north of that particular region and near Nechayev. But Ukrainian sources also mention that there are clashes going on in Porechnoy, so it's not fully under Ukrainian control. Then southwards here, we have this video from Ruskaya Konopelka. This is a Ukrainian attempt to infiltrate into the next Russian sort of line of defense running along this ravine, because at that point you don't have any other sort of organized settlement for measuring it. Another, let's see this. It's about 14 kilometers, and so that region in between the two chains of villages is rather dense in forested regions, which the Ukrainians really are thriving on, and also a lot of open fields. And so the Ukrainians would like to get control over these villages here. So far, they don't have any confirmed captures. But if we are to zoom in, then you'll see that the Ukrainians were able to move in an armored personnel carrier or infantry fighting vehicle into the village. And then they were spotted and attacked by actually a BTR-82. And it was able to destroy, I believe, based on the footage we saw, that specific vehicle that the Ukrainians sent in. And it was doing so based on its machine gun fire from or cannon fire from really close quarters. And so it shows that the Russian vehicles are also over here, and the Russians are aware of the threats and are trying to solidify control. What this also means is that the Ukrainians have likely been able to pass villages such as Kolmakov and Agronom, and that there are no longer Russian forces here. The Ukrainians probably captured these two villages. And so, yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.